Welcome everyone to episode 58 of the Brandon Adams podcast. I'm here with Alex Hutchinson. This is an absolute pleasure because I've read Alex's book, Endure, Mind, Body, and the Curiously Elastic Limits of Human Performance twice. I had the pleasure of reading his latest book, The Explorer's Gene, last week. I got an advance copy. Um, I actually, Alex, you don't know this, but I tried to do a podcast with you a couple of years ago, and I couldn't get through the channels, and I
Oh no, I'm sorry to hear that, but I'm glad the timing worked out this time.
to go through the publisher and book this appointment. Thanks so much for doing this.
I'm delighted, and I'm sorry I didn't I'm sorry I didn't hear from you last time, but I'm glad it's working out now.
No worries. So let's go through your whole journey. You have the most unusual background for a journalist, especially a fitness journalist. You have a PhD in physics from Cambridge.
Yeah, it wasn't part of some grand master plan. I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do in life, and coming out of high school, actually the advice I got was do the hardest thing you can because it's easier to go from hard stuff to less quantitative stuff than it is to go the other way around. So I started with physics. It was pretty cool. I did an undergraduate degree, then I did a PhD. Still didn't know what I wanted to do. Did some postdoctoral research, and then finally in my late 20s realized physics is interesting to me, but I don't have a passion for it. And so I went back and I decided to do a journalism degree at that point, which was a bit of a plunge into the unknown because I didn't know much about journalism, but it seemed to me that to be a career that might offer me the opportunity to pursue the things I was passionate about, things like endurance sports, and use my interest in science. And so yeah, it was a big left turn.
At the risk of derailing things, I want to go into this piece of advice. Study the hardest stuff you can. I got that same advice when I was an undergrad, and it's very valuable. The professor told me exactly what was going to happen in my life. He said that your attention span is going to get shorter and shorter year by year. And you're actually never going to be able to learn this stuff later in life. So you better learn it now, and you should do the demanding stuff while you're young because you absolutely won't do it while you're old. I thought that was a quite unique piece of advice at the time. Someone gave you basically the same advice.
Yeah, and it wasn't just about young versus old. It was, coming out of high school, I was contemplating, and it really looking back, it's like I happened to have good teachers in a few subjects that got my interest, and so I was like, I like physics. I also like history. Should I do physics or history? And basically the advice I got from a few people was like, if you start by studying physics and decide you want to study history, you can do that. If you start by studying history and then decide you want to study physics, those doors are pretty much closed. Like you can't waltz in. And so studying physics, I was able to take some electives in history, for example. But if I'd studied history, I wouldn't have been able to take electives in physics. Because there's some forms of knowledge are really, they're structured. You can't learn without learning B and A. And physics is like that, and a lot of sciences are. You have to know calculus to get anywhere in physics, for example. And so it seemed like the way of keeping the most options open was to do the hardest possible things I could do. And also, it's like, and this is something actually not, this isn't intended as a segue, but it's something I discuss in the book. But challenges are satisfying, and so to do the hardest thing I could do, it's like in the concept of flow, it's like to get into flow, you need to have a challenge that's just within your capacity, something that pushes you to your limits. And I knew that doing physics would do that. So I don't do physics anymore, and it didn't turn out to be my passion, but I have no regrets about studying it because it was a really interesting way of stretching my intellectual capacity and pushing me to my limits of things that I could, barely understand or in some cases couldn't understand.
That's amazing. So this physics journey came after your peak running or before? Because okay, in your Twitter profile, it says a nearly 4 minute miler, and in the opening chapters of Endure, you talk about how you were somewhat of a late bloomer. Take us through your running journey.
Sure. And that was also quite a nonlinear journey. So I I started training seriously in about grade 10, so when I was about 15, and I was uh had a lot of success right away. I did very well in my first year or two of running, and it looked like I was on a trajectory to be a high school star. And then I kind of plateaued or tanked. I had mononucleosis in my, in high school and missed a year. And so then I was sort of mediocre for my last couple of years of high school. And through college, I was an okay, like I ran on my college team, but I wasn't very good until in my third year. Then I had a big breakthrough. I went from trying to being the equivalent of about a 420 miler to being the equivalent of about a 4 minute miler, just over 4 minute miler. And as is often the case, it's like if I'd been great all through high school and university, I would have maybe done like a lot of college runners do, which is you get to the end of your 4 years of college and say, well, that was a fun experience, time to move on with life. But instead, I just had this new taste of, oh wow, now I'm actually competitive at a national level and maybe even can be competitive at an international level. So I was excited to keep running post collegiately. I then, in my first year after university, when I was in grad school doing my PhD in physics, I got a knee injury that kept me out for a couple of years. So again, then I was back in the valley of despair there. But I was still hungry to find out what I could do. So part of the reason I stayed in physics as long as I did is that physics is it's not a 9 to 5 job. Like it's about thinking and doing lab work, but you can structure your time flexibly. And so I was able to train at a pretty high level until, and I would say until I was 28, running was the most important thing in my life. I was trying to make the Olympics, and I didn't, and I didn't actually come all that close to it, if I'm being honest. But I prioritized that more than I prioritized my physics. But I was doing them in parallel. So when I was a postdoc, I was doing research, but I was also training with a really strong training group in Washington, D.C. And, you know, physics was my job and running was my passion. And when I was 28, that was 2004. A few months before that year's Olympic trials, I got a stress fracture in my lower back, which basically I still run to this day and compete and enjoy it. But that stress fracture basically ended my serious running career. And so that was also the impetus to say, okay, I'm no longer going to pour my passion into running. So then I don't want my day job to be something that's I'm not super passionate about. And so that is when I then made a decision to leave physics and switch to journalism in the hope that I could, instead of having physics to pay the bills and running to fill the passion, that I could find something that would allow me to unite those two things and be spend my time being passionate about it. And that was being a journalist and pursuing a career like that.
Do you compete in masters events now?
I do, and it's been a mix over the years of what I focus on. Last few years, I've been running masters cross country, and part of the reason there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that cross country times are meaningless, so it allows me to I've been racing against the clock since I was 15, and I love the timed element, the data element of running almost too much. So I think it's good for me to sort of not be focused on how fast I am this year compared to last year. So cross country is more of a pure how fast can you run today? It doesn't matter where you were last year. And the other thing about cross country is it can be a team sport. And so I have a group of friends that I train with, and we run as a team and compete I'm in Canada, so at the provincial and national masters cross country meet. And it gives an extra element to it, that social element of competing with and competing against friends. It makes it more than just going out again and running against the clock.
So in 2011, you had a book come out that was Which Comes First, Cardio or Weights, where you answered every question that one could conceivably have about running and training, from nutrition to injury prevention to stretching protocols, supplementation, on and on. I'm wondering, have there been substantial revisions to your thinking since then, or does most of that hold?
Yeah, it's interesting. I would say, 80 to 90% of it, I stand by. And I think that, the basics haven't changed. Like we haven't evolved into a new species since 2011. And we haven't made radical discoveries that like totally overturn our understanding of nutrition or training or anything like that. But there are definitely things in there that my thinking has evolved on. I guess, I mean, there are some big things that have changed in the last 15 years, or big debates that have been had about things like running shoes, minimalist versus maximalist running shoes, or carbohydrates. Should you go ketogenic or should you go as much carbohydrates? All those debates are where the big debates are. I don't think actually my position has changed much, and it tends to be fairly middle of the road, and of the opinion that there are multiple different ways that you can go, none of which is the only way to do it. I guess if I were to pinpoint my biggest change in perspective, I've become more skeptical of improvement in a bottle of supplements, of ergogenic aids, of tick, whether it's ketones or vitamins or juices or things like that. At the time, I thought I had a high standard for evidence. I would say I'm not interested in anything if it doesn't have a double-blinded, placebo-controlled, randomized trial that shows that it works, which I thought was a pretty high standard of evidence. Now, I would say, even if it has a double-blinded, placebo-controlled, randomized trial that shows that it works, I'm not necessarily convinced because more or less by the definition of how we evaluate studies, one out of every 20 studies is going to have a statistically significant result, even if it has no effect, just from random fluctuations. And so if you have enough monkeys doing, typing it away, they're going to produce Hamlet. And if you have enough scientists doing studies on ergogenic aids, they're going to do 20 studies and 19 of them are going to show nothing, and they're going to file those away in the desk drawer, and one of them is going to show a positive effect and they're going to publish it, and then a journalist like me is going to say, hey everybody, rubbing seagull poop on your head really does make you faster, and there's a double-blinded placebo-controlled study that proves it. And so having written enough of those articles, I now sort of say to myself, even if there's a study, I would like to see two studies or maybe even three studies from different groups. And my experience has taught me that the hot thing of 2013 will be forgotten in 2016. And so I should learn that the hot thing of 2025, there's a good chance it's going to be forgotten in 2028 and we'll be talking about something else. Whereas the basics, get out and accumulate mileage, do a lot of slow running and some fast running, recover enough. These things will continue to be true.
So do you take any supplements personally?
I take zero supplements at the moment. I I occasionally feel guilty that I'm not taking vitamin D supplements. I live in Canada. The sun is pretty weak for 10 months of the year. I'm not actually convinced. Like the evidence to me is mixed. Like, yes, I know that the sun produces vitamin D. I'm not sure that that supplementing vitamin D replaces the things you get by not being in the sun. To cover my bets, and because there doesn't seem to be any downside of taking moderate amounts of vitamin D, in theory think that it might be worth taking in vitamin D, but I'm not convinced enough that I've actually bothered to go out and I used to take it. I ran out of pills a couple of years ago, and I've never bothered to restock. So I take zero pills. It doesn't. There are some pills that might be useful for some people in some contexts, but part of my thinking on supplements is that I don't think most of them do anything. If for people who are not like, if you have a frank deficiency, you're going to get scurvy if you don't have enough vitamin C, right? But most of us are not like British sailors in the 1700s. We're getting vitamin C from all sorts of dietary sources. So I don't think most of them do much. But I also think, and this is maybe more of a personal thing or a puritanical thing, that I think that reaching for supplements, in doing so, we often give ourselves permission uh, to then take other shortcuts in other areas. So it's like, I'm taking a multivitamin, so I'm not going to worry that I didn't pack any fruits and vegetables in my lunch today. Like I've got my bases covered because I'm taking insert name of supplement here. And so by not taking a supplement, I'm taking away the training wheels and trying to force myself to do the things that I think are, I mean, I think if you compare eating fresh and diverse food, healthy foods, that's always going to come out ahead of taking a pill. And so I want to force myself to do that, and instead of trying to, to hope that I'm getting at the same from a powder.
So there's a mafia, if you will, what they call the podcast bro circuit. That, just to be clear, I absolutely love these guys. But it's people like Peter Attia and Andrew Huberman that have health advice. I value them tremendously as a resource, but I know that they kind of drink each other's Kool-Aid, circulate the same stuff among each other. I'm curious where you differ with them, and I want to start by talking about protein because both Attia and Huberman recommend a lot of protein, more than you recommend in your book. Uh, I'm wondering, do you disagree with them there, and where else might you disagree with them?
So first, yeah, this is a good and an interesting and a potentially controversial question. So let me start with a general point that I think uh, there is a range of podcasting bros, and with the, even within a given podcasting bro, I think they have more credibility on some topics than others. Um, Peter Attia, uh, I think he's a very insightful and incisive both interpreter of scientific researcher and explainer of scientific research. So I actually have a lot of respect for what he does. I don't always agree with where he comes down on recommendations, but so there's like I make a distinction between like someone has read the scientific literature, they understand its strengths and limitations, and then from that point they make a decision as to what the right thing to do is. And I might make a different decision, but we're looking at the same facts. And so Peter, for instance, I think is a little more willing to experiment to take things like rapamycin, uh, and he would agree that there isn't strong evidence yet that this is gonna that this is a good thing to do, but it's convincing enough to him that he's willing to try it. Whereas I would say I look at the same evidence, I see the same evidence, and I'm like, look at the last 10 supplements that have been thought to be the fountain of youth, whether it's metformin or resveratrol or whatever the case may be. They haven't panned out, and in some cases they've had negative effects. So I would rather wait until we've actually shown that something helps before leaping on it. So that's a question not of interpreting science. It's a question of risk reward analysis, or the benefits of trying unproven things. On the other end of the podcast bro spectrum, there's people who are just out there selling branded products. Essentially, they're grifting. And so I have zero faith in the ability of someone who's selling a supplement line to tell me honestly what their supplements work, uh, or to trust that. So that's okay. That's general comments on the the podcast bro world. Protein, I would actually say my thoughts on protein have probably evolved a little bit since Cardio and Weights was published in 2011. I do think higher levels of protein are probably useful or can be useful, particularly as you get older. There's now evidence that your anabolic sensitivity, like the amount of muscle building that takes place in response to a given amount of muscle, decreases as you get older. So the amounts that might have been appropriate for a 20-year-old, by the time you're 40 or 60, you might want to take more protein. And I also think, and I think this is maybe an evolution of my views since 2011, that it's not just about how much protein you take per day, that when you take it matters. That if you're just kind of having a bowl of cereal in the morning and a light lunch and then eating half a cow at dinner, you may be getting a ton of protein, but you're not necessarily getting it when you need it. And so I am now compared to a decade ago, much more conscious of trying to get protein at every meal and substantial amounts of protein. So, ideally 20 grams if I can, and maybe more. And so you asked if I used supplements, and I actually now that you mentioned it, I should say I do have protein powder in my cupboard. I don't use it super regularly, but particularly when I've done strength training, I don't think protein powder does anything that food doesn't do. But if I'm doing strength training in the morning and I'm going to have a breakfast that might be, some cereal with nuts and some toast and peanut butter, stuff like that. So I'm going to get some protein, but not a ton. Then I'll also take a couple scoops of protein powder. So, maybe another 12 grams of protein from protein powder as a matter of convenience. So all of which is say, um, I'm not exactly sure how high some of these guys are recommending protein. I don't think you need to megadose it, but I think there's a big difference between what the recommended daily allowance that you get from government organizations that's enough to be healthy, but to optimize how much muscle repair and growth you get, those are two different thresholds. And I think people sometimes conflate the two and think I'm getting enough protein to survive, but that doesn't mean you're maximizing the amount of muscle you can get. And as a skinny endurance athlete, as a runner, I'm increasingly conscious that if I'm not careful, I'm going to get to age 75 and have not enough muscle left to do the things that I want to do in life, or let alone 80 or 85. So I think protein is important, and I pay attention to it for sure, and eat more, try to eat more than the minimum requirements.
So the name of the book, which comes first, cardio or weights, to tease the answer, it's whichever one is more important for you, especially on that particular day. You point out that people tend to have their thing, whether it's cardio or weights, and rarely are people great at both. You do take the stand that weight training is extremely important. Um, I'm wondering, you point out that you're a skinny endurance athlete, you don't hold a lot of muscle. I recently had a running challenge. Uh, I found it very important to cut weight. Um, and when I do weight training, I find it almost metabolically wasteful because what frequently happens to me is I start a weight training program. I become insatiably hungry. I gain strength and muscle very quickly. I put on weight, and then I'm like, okay, great. I'm strong, but this is not where I want to be. I want to be fast on the tennis court. I want to have a good 5K time. And then I cut all that weight off, and then I'm back to square one. And okay, fine. I'm strong enough because I do that process, but it also feels wasteful to yo-yo in that way, and it's certainly painful when you go through those periods of cutting weight. So how do you manage this process?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, that's a good reminder that no health advice can be universal because people are so different, right? So, and it's interesting. Like my wife puts on muscle quite quickly when she does any sort of strength training. She doesn't even need to put on strength training, and her dad is ripped, and I'm like, I've been doing weights like twice a week for 20 years, and I can't buy an ounce of muscle. Like so people are very different in how they respond, and so they're the what they need, what sort of exercise is most important to them is gonna be different. Like so when I say weights are important for me, that doesn't necessarily mean they're important for you if you're already strong enough. Now, in terms of this problem of going through this cycle, I mean, look, I'm not a personal trainer or anything, but what I would say is maybe there's a middle ground where you're doing a little bit of resistance, and it may be, look, if you're playing lots of tennis, if you have an active lifestyle, maybe you don't need to do any weights, but I would say it's probably useful to do something, but maybe it's at half the intensity of what you're used to doing or half the duration. Or like instead of saying, I'm going to start weights because I'm going to put on I'm going to get strong, you're just going to say, once or twice a week, I'm going to spend 20 minutes doing these four exercises and I'm going to do them. I'm not going to be Hercules. I'm not going to kill myself, but I'm going to make sure that I'm using my muscles and at the very least maintaining the muscle I've got, and establish that habit. So whatever you're doing that causes you to go into this rebound, this metabolic rebound effect, dial it back and see whether you can find something that's a little more sustainable. That's just that's the first thought that comes to mind for me.
Could you elaborate on that term, metabolic rebound effect?
Yeah, no, I mean, I guess I kind of made that up. What I mean is the it's a common, I mean, it's a common and much debated thing. It's like, and it's not just for strength training. Let's say you start running, people, or start any sort of exercise, then you get hungry, and so you eat a bunch, and actually, you start an exercise program where you're burning 500 calories a day, but your caloric intake increases by 600 calories a day or 800 calories a day. And so you're getting a paradoxical effect where by burning calories, you're causing yourself to have a net surplus of calories and gaining weight. And so this is, I think, there's a lot. Look, this is a controversial topic in exercise science, but it's like how much of this is physiologically driven that your body just is recognizing something? How much of it is behavioral? How much of it is psychological? Like, do you just have to learn to feel different after a workout? And I don't have answers to that, but in a sense, it doesn't really matter what the underlying cause is. If the effect is that you start doing weights and you put on a bunch of unwanted fat, then you need to think about how you're doing weights and try something different. And whether that's, you know, doing it at a lower intensity or lower duration or lower frequency, or thinking about when you do it or what you eat afterwards to try and make sure that you don't end up hungry. That there may be ways uh, of structuring that program that work a little better that don't produce these unwanted effects that sort of rebound, what I was calling a rebound effect.
I had sort of an N equals one experiment where I did the resting metabolic rate before I started a cut, like after I had done one of these sort of weight gain things, and then after a long cut. And I expected that the resting metabolic rate would go down a lot as my body adapted to the low calorie, the long cutting phase. And it was a fairly aggressive cut. And I found it interesting that it didn't really change. Like it was,
Hmm.
I think it was like 50 calories lower. Mine's super high generally, and it was like 50 calories lower after the long cut. It could have been,
Yeah,
yes, but
and who know, like it may be that it takes a year but I mean, it's sometimes like when people when people's bodies adapt, when they have a set point at a higher weight, it can be very hard to budge that. Uh, and the body adjusts to a higher weight very quickly. Whereas when you go to a lower weight, those adaptations seem to take much longer. So I mean, it sounds like you've got a high resting metabolic rate or a high metabolic rate, which is in most cases a good thing to have because it can be very hard to budge that. And there's a lot of we understand some of the environmental or behavioral things that can change environmental rate, but or metabolic rate, but uh, genetics plays a big role too. And so you may just have a pretty strong set point that's hard to budge.
so before we go into the explorer's gene, I wanted to ask you one question about Endure, which is one of my all-time favorite books. Have it deeply underlined, read it twice. Um, I want I want you to go through the sort of theory and practice of stretching your limits. The subtitle of the book is Mind, Body, and the Curiously Elastic Limits of Human Performance. And it seems like for you, you had both a practical journey and a theoretical journey. The practical journey was first, where you had a key session where you broke what you thought were your limits. And then later you had the theory behind it all. So maybe you could take us through that a little bit.
Sure. So, in terms of the how to stretch your limits, I think the first thing to understand, or the first, maybe the most important point, is to understand that your limits are stretchable. And this is not as trivial as it sounds, because there's two ways to think about the limits of endurance or the limits of performance more broadly. One is that they're kind of mathematical, that our bodies are essentially machines, which in many ways they are, right? We've got, little engines inside, and we're using them to burn fuel to create force. And so you can you can think that the sort of 20th century physiology is this story of understanding the body as a machine. And if it's a machine, you can calculate its limits. And so in the running context, it's like if you know someone's VO2 max, which is kind of the size of their engine, and if you know their running economy, which is the kind of gas mileage of their car, and if you know their lactate threshold, which kind of tells you how well you can sustain or what fraction of maximum power you can sustain, there is literally an equation, and you can plug in uh, values to those equations, and it will tell you how fast you should be able to run a marathon. So in that picture, if I go out and run a race, if I run a 5K and I run as hard as I can, that that whatever time I run, that should reflect, well, it's a function of my VO2 max and my running economy and my lactate threshold. So if I want to get faster, I have to improve one of those parameters. So I have to go and train to get better, to improve my lactate threshold or whatever. And at a certain point, if I've improved those as much as I can, then that's what I'm capable of running. And it's, that it's simply like if you're racing drag racers or something like that, you put down the gas pedal as hard as it goes, and that's how fast your machine goes. And there's nothing more you can do. If But that is not the subjective experience of, I think, anybody who has ever competed in any endurance event. It's not that when you're in 505 mile shape, every time you go out and run a mile, you run 505. That's that like, and sometimes you run 530, sometimes you run 459. And it's not always predictable. It's not always, well, I didn't sleep well last night, or I didn't get enough fuel, or my training went poorly. Sometimes it's like, I don't know, I just had a really good one today. And what does that mean to have a good one? What does that mean that today I was really able to dig deep and really pushed right to my edge and ran the greatest race possible? Or another way of saying that is, why is it that nobody sets world records in endurance events in practice? That actually happens in things like shot put and pole vault. But in an endurance event, nobody is able to push themselves hard enough without the external factors of like a crowd, of stakes of prize money, of rivals. All these things allow us to dig deeper. And none of those things have any effect on your lactate threshold or your VO2 max. They only affect your mind, your perception of what's happening. So sorry, this is a very roundabout way of saying that the understanding limits as a function of the human machine that you can calculate from your body is incomplete because it doesn't include the brain. And so when you ask, how do we stretch our limits? What we're really talking about here is, of course, training is important, and you should do things to improve your VO2 max and yada, yada, yada. But what we're talking about here is, how do we get the most, given a certain body on a certain day, given what your fitness is, how can you squeeze the most out of that in one day? And there's a domain of sports psychology that has tried to help athletes work through these things. But I would say the science on this is really just starting. And in Endure, I go through some of the attempts to manipulate the brain that people have used, whether it's electric brain stimulation that was a sort of is or was a promising way of manipulating the brain's perception of effort so that you could push harder. Your body was doing the same pushing, but it just felt easier, so you were able to maintain it for longer. The evidence on that is a little mixed. There's ideas like that, but then what it really comes down to for me in terms of what I think is practical, what I think is useful is understanding the role of like sports psychology, understanding the role of self-belief, understand the inner monologue in your head. What are you telling yourself? There's what's that? There's a famous book from the 70s, The Inner Game of Tennis, I think,
Sure.
one of the great classics. And I think what the big thing for me, the big journey of discovery for me in writing Endure was understanding that the inner game of running, or the inner game of endurance in general, or the inner game of performance in the broadest sense, is much more important and amenable to change than I realized as a sort of physicist who was very focused on the measurable aspects of performance. I was overlooking the idea that if I'm standing on the start line saying, I don't think I can do this, this is way too hard, that has a real effect on how hard I'm going to be able to push myself.
So in Endure, you mention Tim Noakes as a leading figure in what I believe was called central governor theory, the idea that the brain is in control, um, and the brain is very conservative in shutting down the body and getting you to slow down or stop because it doesn't doesn't want any harm to come to you. And when it sees that the heart rate is increasing and the body temperature is increasing, it says, wait a second, are we sure we want to do this? This seems unsafe. And it makes you kind of want to shut down early. You describe the the limits of how hard one can push oneself as well. You actually do kind of go overboard and you pass out. Has this ever happened to you, or have you ever seen this happen, like where someone pushes so hard that they actually pass out? And how damaging is it for them?
So yeah, I mean the central governor model, its basic claim was that we're so that the brain is wired for self-preservation. So I can't just go down to the street right now and say, I'm going to run till I fell unconscious. I will get tired before I get unconscious. And it is very, 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 very hard to run yourself to oblivion. Now, occasionally, we all see clips of, someone at the Ironman triathlon or something. There's some famous scenes of people just like keeling over just before the finish line and like crawling and then falling unconscious. Usually, when that happens, that's a function of heat stroke that, the brain is trying to prevent you from all sorts of bad things from happening. It's trying to prevent your heart from, bursting or whatever. It's trying to prevent you from overheating. It sometimes gets the heating wrong. Like it doesn't have perfect knowledge of how hot you're getting. And so that is one area where highly motivated athletes in very hot and humid conditions, pushing very hard for long periods of time, can sometimes push themselves into heat stroke, which can be super dangerous. Now, for me, I think the closest I came was in my last year of university at the National Collegiate Championships. I had a race that I thought I could win, but it was going to be close. And I won't tell the whole like 45-minute war story, but basically I led the race for the last 400 meters, and another runner came up on my shoulder with 60 meters to go, and I was just like, this is my last university race. This is my chance to finally win a national title. I had won a silver medal before, but I had never won a national title. And I dug as deep as I had ever dug before, and have dug since, and probably will ever dig to try and hold off that runner. But he just kept inching past me. And with about 10 meters to go, my body shut down in a way that I actually sort of stumbled the last 10 meters, and two runners caught me at the finish line. I ended up fourth, which was psychologically devastating. But I was physically devastated in a way that I have never been. I was able to sort of stagger 30 meters past the finish line, collapse on the infield, and then I started vomiting. And I was vomiting for about 45 minutes. Long after there was nothing left in my stomach, I was just dry heaving bile for about 45 minutes and I couldn't get up. And that night, I was awake the entire night. I was so strung out that I couldn't close my eyes, and which was bad because I had another race the next day. Um, I've never experienced anything like that. Like I know I went to a place like that race was on in one way very disappointing because I thought I could win and I came fourth. I didn't even get a medal. But in other ways, it's maybe the race that one of the races that I'm most proud of in my life because we all the point of the central governor theory is that when you reach exhaustion, it's not that you've reached your body's limits. Your brain is just saying that's enough. And most races you cross the line and it's like, yeah, I can keep jogging a little bit. That race was one where there was nothing left on the table. And it's very hard to go to that place. And I never want to go to that place again. But I was very proud that I went to that place once. And I still didn't pass out, but it was clear that I was, whatever safety margin the central governor was trying to keep for me, I ate into a lot of it.
What causes the vomiting in that situation? Is it from the muscles or is it something related to
Yeah, the truth is, I have no idea. I don't think it wasn't like digestion or stomach. I hadn't eaten anything for hours and hours. There was nothing in my stomach. I think it somehow it was just a symptom of general physiological like sound all the alarm systems to nothing, the whole organism is going haywire. So yeah, I don't know exactly, and I'm not the only person to have experienced things like this, and I've discussed it with other people, and no one's really entirely sure why the stomach is like the best explanation I can offer is that the brain does not know what the hell is going on. So it's applying all its defense systems, and that means you're going to pass out. It wants to get you to lie down, and maybe it's like, well, maybe something's wrong in our stomach. Let's vomit just in case that we're feeling this way because there's some toxin in our stomach. So I think it's just a generalized defense mechanism, but I don't actually know.
when when I wasn't in good shape or wasn't in the same shape that I'm in now, I would uh sometimes have the situation where I would push too hard and I would be out of breath, like really out of breath. And then there would be like a slight panic that, wow, I'm never going to be able to catch my breath. Like this is dangerous. And that could last for some period of time, a minute or so, and then it would be okay. Um, I found that as I've gotten in good shape, that tends not to happen, maybe because my heart rate dives quickly after I finish, and so I catch my breath easier. Do you ever have that sensation where you've run so hard and now you really feel like you can't catch your breath?
Uh, So less these days, and I think your experience is pretty common in the sense that it happens when you're just getting into shape. So I think there's two things that happen there. One is that your body gets fitter, right? So your heart is stronger, you have better, your lungs are better able to deliver oxygen, and your capillary, you have better circulatory system. So your feeling of being out of breath, you can physiologically correct what's out of balance more quickly. But I think there's also, and I think this is super, super familiar effect for people. There's an emotional element of discomfort. And so a lot of what we experience as I'm exhausted and I can't go any farther it's not that our legs have stopped working or that our lungs have stopped working or whatever the case may be, or that our heart can't beat any faster. It's that we're experiencing the symptoms of distress or of physiological distress, and we're reacting like exactly what you said of like, oh no, what if I can't catch my breath? Like what if, and that's scary. So let's say for someone who hasn't run in since gym class 20 years ago or whatever, and decides to get in shape and run a 5K with their friends. The first few times they run, they're going to get really out of breath really quickly, and that's going to be a feeling that they haven't felt in years or decades, if ever. And it's scary because it's like being trapped underwater. You feel like you can't catch your breath. And that just makes the situation worse because then you're adding on a layer of panic and fear to that. And so part of what happens as you get in shape, yes, your heart gets stronger. Yes, your circulatory system gets better, but also you're familiar with this feeling of out of breath and you know it will pass in a minute. And this is a common phenomenon for any sort of discomfort. If you know it's going to end in 30 seconds, it becomes infinitely less bothersome than if you're like, is this going to last forever? So when you know it's transient, then it's like, oh, this is just, it becomes information rather than an emotional response. And I think in terms of learning to push limits, that's really one of the most powerful things you can do is go to your current limits, take a step beyond them, feel what it feels like. It won't feel good. But if you do that over and over again, then eventually you're like, okay, now I know what it feels like to be one step beyond. So let's go two steps beyond my limits. Because you're no longer there's no longer an emotional response. It's just you realize that all these symptoms of distress, being out of breath, having your legs burning, they're not signs that your legs are literally on fire. It's just information from your body telling you that you can't sustain this forever.
When you were a competitive runner, you described situations where you started races too fast to your benefit, which is not likely to happen for most people. Most of the time, when you have that feeling of being out of breath early in the race or mid race, that is big trouble. And so we attempt to avoid it by pacing ourselves. But you described some situations where you started fast and felt like maybe you were pushing up against that moment where you would be out of breath and would gas out, but then were able to keep that fast pace.
Yeah. So, and look, for inexperienced runners, uh, of course, the most common phenomenon is they go out too fast. Like, let's say you're running a 10K or something. Their pace in the first 2K is much faster than their pace in their last 2K, and so they needed to even it out. But after a while, as you train for a while, you start to get a sense of like, how fast do I think I can run? And so then you say, well, if I want to run 40 minutes for 10K, that means I need to run 4 minutes per K. And so then you start to kind of dial in to rather than running based on how fast you feel, you're like, well, I need to run 4 minutes per K. So I'm going to run at 4 minutes. And so for some people, myself included, this evolves into a kind of obsession with the right pace where your total focus is on running at the pace you've predetermined is the appropriate one for you. Even if you feel great, even if it's like, you, even if you're having a great day, this kind of takes away the possibility of having a great day because you're like, I've decided I'm going to trying to run 40 minutes for 10K. That means I'm going to run 4 minute pace per K from the start. Maybe that day you're ready to run 38 minutes, but you're not giving yourself a chance. And so what's happened to me a couple times is when things have gone wrong and I haven't got the right, my pay, the timekeeping has not given me the appropriate feedback. So I don't know how fast I'm running. I end up running faster than I expect. And then it ends up being okay. It turns out I can sustain that faster pace, but I've been sort of by pacing myself, I've been too cautious. Now, some people are temperamentally people have different temperaments. And so some people are prone to always go, they're always optimistic and always going out and they're willing to take risks and they're always going out hard and they're never in danger of going out too slow. I was the opposite. I was risk averse, maybe overly analytical. So if I had a predominant error, it was going out too conservatively and then having a great finishing kick in the last 200 meters. But it's like, what's the point of having a great finishing kick when you're 2 minutes behind where you could have been if you had run more aggressively from the start? And in terms of the feeling at halfway, just as an aside, my experiential advice for running the 5K is if you get to halfway and you think, okay, it's all right, I'm going to be able to sustain this pace, that means you screwed up. You should get to halfway feeling like there is no way I can sustain this pace. And if you do, if you're, I mean, you may be right, but and you're about to blow up, but you, the pace that is sustainable for 5K, if you're really pushing yourself, should feel unsustainable at the halfway mark. Like you should be pushing hard enough that you doubt you can make it, and then it turns out by great effort, you are able to sustain it.
I love that. Um, my big challenge for myself right now, I'm trying to recruit others. Uh, what I want other 40 plus year olds to do it. I'm 46. I would call it the 40-40 challenge. You do the Central Park loop in under 40 minutes.
Ooh,
And I'm sure you've run that many times, but it's a classic run. And the beauty of it is that it's right at a 10K and it's got 175 vertical feet. Um, Basically, all of the uphill is in the last third. Are you familiar with that run?
yeah, it's a very hilly one. I lived in New York for 1 year, so it's been a while, but I've definitely run that loop a lot of times. Um,
You mentioned in your book that most runners make the mistake of going too slow, um, too slow on the downhill when they should be kind of really cruising at that point, and then too fast on the uphill. Um, that's good advice. I'm going to try that next time.
Yeah, it takes some practice to be able to flow down the hill without you have to really figure out what works for your stride. But yeah, you'll find that you get to the bottom of a hill and you're like, oh, I feel less out of breath. Well, it's like, oh, well, that means you effectively went slower in your relative effort. You want to still be pushing down the hills without trashing your legs. That's the challenge.
When I trained for the 5K, I did all interval training. I never actually ran a 5K until the race, which I needed a coach to be able to do that, but it worked out great. Um, for the 10K, I have a similar training plan. Do you agree with this that most of your training should be kind of tough intervals and you shouldn't actually run the race itself, the distance itself?
I, I don't agree, but like
Okay.
I said, there are many roads to Rome. So probably the dominant approach uh, in distance running training is what's sometimes called polarized training, although the name is not very useful or accurate, but would basically be the basic advice would be 80% of your training should be long, slow, uh, conversational pace. You can sustain a conversation, and 20% you should be trying to see God, uh, doing hard intervals. Um, this doesn't necessarily, it's not a universal formula, but that's kind of the pattern over the last 30 or 40 years that has emerged among top distance runners. It's what I do. Maybe I run probably 6 days a week. Typically, four of those at least would be just easy, slow, conversational jogs, and then one or two interval, like one maybe medium interval session and one hard interval session. I've also trained. There was a time I mentioned in my shortly after my undergraduate degree, I had a knee injury for a couple of years, and that actually, when I was coming back from that, I couldn't run long distances. I would start acting, my knee would start acting up if I ran more than about half an hour. So for a while, I was running 4 times a week, which was basically 3 interval workouts and one hard run. And I actually ran surprisingly well off that. I was able to compete surprisingly well off that. So there are many ways to many roads to Rome. For me, in terms of enjoyment and balance and sustainability, I would I like I would say some easy running is a good part of it, but I there are different ways of doing it.
I like it. So Endure and the Explorer's gene kind of blend together a little bit because in Endure you talk about sort of spectacular feats of endurance that are not running related, not race related. And Explorer's gene delves into that a bit more. You talk about how uh, you increasingly became interested in pushing yourself in other ways, strenuous hikes and adventure challenges. Take us through that journey.
Yeah. So, I mean, in a way, so Endear came out in 2018, and it was all about, as we've been discussing, like, how do we push our limits? And I would say what Explorer is about in some ways, or what the Explorer's gene is about, is why do we push our limits? What are we looking for? Um, and I mean that in the literal sense of endurance challenges or of exploring, new territory, but I also mean it in a much broader sense. Why do we explore new career options? Why do we not always order the same dish in a restaurant, although some people do, but why are we drawn to try something different rather than just doing the same thing? So there's this what's often called the explore exploit dilemma. Should we stick with what we know where we're going to have predictable payoff, or should we try something different where that might turn out to be better or might turn out to be worse? And I think but basically the argument I make in the book is that we are wired in some fundamental way to want to find out about the unexplored option, to pursue the unknown, and that doing this is useful both from a kind of tactical sense in that it produces better outcomes in the long term. If you're exploring, you're going to get better career options, better restaurant meals or whatever if you don't always just stick with the same thing. But it also feels good. It also is rewarding and it actually generates a sense of meaning. And I think that's the bridge to like, why do we do hard things? Why do you want to run the Central Park Loop in under 40 minutes? Why do you want to do that? Well, you want to find out if you can. You want to take on a challenge where the outcome is not predetermined and find out whether you're about yourself and generate this sense of meaning. So yeah, so I definitely see the two books as kind of one leading to the next. How do we push our limits? And okay, now we're pushing them. Why are we pushing them? What are we chasing? And what does it give us?
So I have two kids, and they are on probably opposite ends of that explore exploit spectrum. My boy being the more explore oriented, and my girl being more focused and disciplined. Um, I wonder if you could take us through what is the explorer's gene? You're able to pinpoint it and how that relates to modern society, ADD, things like that.
Yeah. So first of all, I should say calling the book The Explorer's Gene was a sort of maybe a deliberately provocative decision. There isn't a single gene that determines exploration for sure. There's a lot of factors, both probably a lot of different genes and also a lot of environmental factors. But there is one specific gene where there's been some really fascinating research and it's a gene called the DRD4 gene, which it is related to a dopamine receptor. And about 50,000 years ago, there was a new mutation appeared in that, random mutation in that receptor that changed the sensitivity of the receptor to not to dopamine. And so, in other words, and dopamine is part of this reward circuitry that responds to novelty or to new and unexpected things. And at around that the same time, that's when humans really started spreading around the globe. Until then, there'd been various human and human ancestor species that had been sort of bouncing around Africa and Asia and Europe. Around 50,000 years ago, they got serious and they spread out relatively quickly to every habitable spot on the globe. We're talking Easter Island, we're talking the Arctic, we're talking the southern tip of South America. The humans really got uh, wandery. They wanted to move. Now, what's interesting about this DRD4 gene, first of all, you can look at populations around the world and say, well, how far did they have to migrate to get where they are now over the last 10 or 20,000 years? The farther they had to migrate, the higher the percentage of the population tends to have the explorer's version of this novelty seeking gene, which suggests that there is something going on here, something driven genetically about that helps these populations either decide to migrate or thrive in new places. But then you can look today and say, well, what does this gene do now? And it turns out that this DRD4 gene, the explorer's version of the gene, is associated with ADHD. Which, when you think about ADHD, what like it's it for a 9-year-old boy sitting in a classroom, ADHD is a it is a maladaptive trait. It does not make you a good 9-year-old boy sitting in a classroom. For a hunter-gatherer looking for new sources of food, trying to explore the territory, the sort of relentless desire to keep moving, always find out what's next, that can be a very adaptive trait. So, what we call ADHD may be, one end of a spectrum of some people are wired more to always need to know what's around the next corner. Now, the one key point that I want to make about this is that this doesn't mean that like some people are wired to explore and other people aren't wired to explore. It's not an on-off switch. We all have a DRD4 gene. We all have the same reward circuitry, and we're all in some respect wired to want to find out about the unknown. This is a sort of fundamental human thing. Some people have a stronger drive than others, a bigger helping of this drive than others. But and when I talk to people about exploring, lots of people are like, "Oh, well, that some people, I'm not interested in exploring." And what they maybe mean by that is, I don't want to parasail to the South Pole on some crazy expedition, and I get that. But I think most people, if they were to think about it enough, they'd realize that there's some aspect of their life in which they are interested in pushing a little bit to new horizons, whether it's listening to new music or trying different careers, starting new hobbies, or running around Central Park in less than 40 minutes. We're in different aspects of our lives, we're driven to kind of find out about ourselves and find out about the world in a way that I think reflects this history as a species that's spread out across the world, always looking for new territory and new places to go.
How were they able to see what you call the explorer variant of this DRD4 gene?
Uh, just with genetic testing, that it's basically a difference in the sequence of DNA bases. So there's a section where there's a certain pattern that repeats, and the number of times it repeats uh, is it changes the function of the receptor. And there's a few different versions of the gene, but it's just a question of, oh, that part of the code repeated 7 times instead of 4 times, and as a result, the receptor, it gets built slightly differently, and it changes how sensitive it is to dopamine.
And you've noted that the ancestors of the explorers, like those who live in far reaches, they tend to have the explorer version of this gene disproportionately. So you mentioned many parts of South America have some of the highest percentages of this variant, and it shapes their societies in a way.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're talking about a small signal among many signals. So there's one of the big debates is, okay, you got a country like the United States, which is mostly populated by people who decided to leave where they were sometime in the last, 5 generations or more, and cross an ocean uh, and set up a totally new life. Are these all people who have the explorer's gene, and does that shape the nature of the society, that it's a sort of frontier based uh, individualistic society compared to uh, you know the countries that they may have come from? The genetic signal for that is not clear. So when people look like, do people in the United States have more DRD4, have the explorer's version of DRD4? That's not obvious. But there are sort of hints that those effects can happen. And one of the interesting ones that doesn't use genetic data, but sort of a proxy for it, is there was a huge Scandinavian migration to the United States in the late 1800s and I think early 1900s. And they have good records of this migration from the ship's passenger lists and the census rolls in Scandinavia. What they find is, among the millions of Scandinavians who came to the to North America, they were more likely to have unusual first names, and so that than the people Scandinavians who stayed behind. And so people who have unusual first names, they view this as a proxy of they came from families that were sort of wired for being different, trying something new, not just sticking with the same old names. And so there's an argument that the Scandinavians who came to the US and went to, Minnesota and places like that, they actually tended to be more individualistic than the average person from Scandinavia. And the secondary consequence of that, you might ask, well, why are Scandinavian countries, why do they have the sort of strongest social welfare systems in the world? Maybe it's because the people who stayed tended on average to be a little bit more conformist and collectivist than the people who left who came from families with that were giving out unusual first names. So these are patterns that show up in the data. It's a little bit we have to be careful kind of thinking we can draw firm conclusions about what's happening or what's not, but it does seem that there may be some societal effects based on how people on average are wired in the society.
The Scandinavian example is interesting because you had the sort of, I don't know, Viking reshaping of society where you think of the Vikings as having the ultimate explorer gene. And so you wonder if like the baseline is high and then the biggest risk takers of the risk takers went to the US.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing about the Vikings to point out is just that people like the Vikings, who are not uncommon, who are going around and leaving their genetic legacies, in a wide range of places. When we talk about like this population is, like this and that population is like that, it's like there's no such thing as a pure population. There's a great book by David Reich, who won the Nobel Prize for ancient DNA studies last year, or the year before, where he describes the work that's trying to trace like where did the people who live in England now come from? And where did the people who now, live in Spain or in Africa or wherever, or, Southern Africa or whatever the case may be. And it's like the answer is always like there were some people who came from the Mongolian steppes and they mixed with some people from, the Middle East and they mixed with some people from there and they moved there and then they were replaced. And then the Vikings came and, 25% of the DNA of modern British people is from the Vikings. And so it gets really hard to draw firm conclusions about which populations have specific characteristics or not.
Your intuition, as it relates to ADD, do you think that these genetic effects are strong enough that one who is wired with the Explorer variant, maybe strongly wired in that way, such that they present as ADD? Um, do you think they find it like almost impossible to do something that is pure exploit professionally, like accounting or something? Has there been much work in terms of relating it to professions?
So let me answer with a related uh, bit of evidence, which was looking at the role of this gene in a group called the Arial, a tribe in northern Kenya. Traditionally, they were hunter-gatherers. Some of the population has settled down to become agriculturalists. And so and in both groups, the proportion of the explorers version of the gene was similar. But if you look at the hunter-gatherers, the the people who, and I think it was like 20% of them had the explorers gene. Among the hunter-gatherers, those who had the explorers gene were more well nourished, suggesting that they're doing well. They're really good at finding food and they're stronger. They have more muscle. Among the farmers, the 20% who had the DRD4 gene or the explorers version of the DRD4 gene were less well nourished, suggesting that they're not thriving. They're not good farmers. They're supposed to be out tilling the field, and instead they're like wondering what's over in the next field. So it's not that those people were unable to farm. They're just not as good at it because it's not as good a match for their temperament. So look, if circumstances dictate that you have a job that requires a certain amount of exploitation, then you're not uh, wired for it. People find ways of adapting. People find ways of working, with the constraints that they're dealt with. You're likely going to be happier and probably more productive and more successful if you can find a role where that aligns with your temperament rather than where you have to fight against it. Now, are there some people who find it completely impossible? I mean, I think probably, yeah. And maybe I don't know to the extent to which medication can then help mitigate or change the symptoms such that they're able to to be an accountant if that's what the circumstances dictate. But yeah, and I don't when there is someone who is, let's say, really, let's say, strong ADD or ADHD, it's not just DRD4. There has to be other things going on. There may be contextual things. There may be other genetic factors. So people have temperaments. In a perfect world, if you can find a career or a calling that works with your temperament, then it's probably going to work work better for you in the long run.
I have two random questions for you about the explorers gene. Um, the first, I'm going to give you both of these questions right now. The first is, what is your greatest personal adventure, your greatest exploration? That can be a combination of the accomplishment itself, the risk involved, so on and so forth. And the second related question is, of all of the explorations that you look at in the book, from the Australian outback to amazing feats of seafaring to the westward migration in North America, the northern migration, what do you consider the greatest exploratory accomplishment?
Ooh, okay. So in my own personal pantheon, and and I should say I'm not an explorer. I'm just a guy. So I've never discovered anything or gone on any like great missions, but I've had a chance to go on some pretty remote trips through the jungles of Papua New Guinea or along the south coast of Tasmania, or I did a great canoe trip in the Yukon where, we were, the only people for hundreds of miles. Um, I think for me, the most fun, the most kind of epic exploration was a trip I did with my wife, or at the time with my brand new girlfriend. We barely knew each other, but we did a 10-day trip in the northern Rockies in a place called the Wilmore Wilderness Area. And what was cool about it is that it doesn't really there's no rangers there, there's no formal trails. You just kind of go where you want. You figure out, I think we can make it through that pass. I think let's get up into that valley. There's an alpine lake there. We'll camp there. We'll see if we can make it up to that peak. And what was cool about that, especially in contrast to the way I tend to travel these days, where you do extensive research, you read people's travel blogs. So even if you're going deep into the backcountry, you kind of know what to expect. It's like, okay, I'm going to need crampons for that part of the trip, or that you need to bring this or that. That Wilmore trip, we were 10 days. We didn't see anybody after the first, like, or the second day. We just went where we wanted. We looked at the landscape and we explored in a very unstructured way. And that was a really cool feeling. It's very hard to these days to get that feeling of like, I really don't know what tomorrow is going to be like. I have no idea what's over that ridge. So, and that trip was now 20 years ago or something like that. I was very fit at the time. My wife was very fit. We covered we covered a lot of ground. We carried heavy packs of food, and we were um, that is not a trip I could do today. I don't think I'd no longer be physically capable of it. So that was fun too, knowing that we were really out there pushing our limits. Now, the greatest feats of exploration, whatever I choose is going to be slightly arbitrary. I will say I spent a lot of time digging into the settlement of Polynesia. Maybe too much time. I got really obsessed with it because it's such a fascinating story. Like, how on earth did people get to Easter Island and, various other uh, places in Polynesia? They're so far away, and there's been this long academic debate. Did they just drift there by accident? In fact, literally this morning, just before I got on the call with you, I was reading there's a new scientific paper um, showing that, gosh, there was some lizard is now thought to have rafted. I'm going to look at it right now while we're talking. It's iguanas draft. They rafted 5,000 miles to settle Fiji. There's new evidence to suggest that they covered 5,000 miles. So it's possible that animals or people can just drift accidentally to places. But the currents and the context makes it clear that actually it's impossible for humans to have gotten to all the islands in Polynesia unless they were willing to deliberately set out to explore, to set out on a little raft that they built out of scraps of wood from their sparsely forested islands and say, let's go towards that open ocean where we have no idea if there's anything there, and let's sail for a week and see if we come to anything, that where there's water that we can refuel. So to me, those are some of that kind of pattern of exploration. We don't know exactly who it was who did it or exactly when they did it, but the successive waves of people who managed to populate every island of Polynesia just blows my mind. But I will also, if I can add a bonus, I will say a couple summers ago, I went to Newfoundland and did some hiking there, and then took a drive up to the very northern tip of the island to Lanceau Meadows, which is the Norwegian settlement from about 1000 AD. And so that was the first time Europeans made it to North America. And of course, when they got there, there were already uh, native people who had come from the other direction, that they had gone over through Asia, across the Bering Strait, and across the Arctic, all the way to Newfoundland. And so, what that site represented, and there's a really cool sculpture that represents it, is the closing of the circle. Humans left Africa; they went off in every different direction, and this was the first time they actually managed to make it around the globe. When the Vikings in Newfoundland met the native people who were already there. So to me, that is also stands as maybe one of the kind of epochal moments in history when humans finally reconnected after their big spread.
What do you say to someone like me who employs a simple version of the precautionary principle? If I might die when I'm doing this, I shouldn't do it. Um, what do you say to these would-be adventurers that don't want to die on their vacations?
Yeah, I'm strongly in favor of not dying, and in fact, so I would it's like so one of the one obvious question that I I face is like, do I have the DRD4 Explorer's gene? And I don't know, and I purposely did not get it tested. I don't want to know. I don't want to start feeling like, oh, I guess I'm not wired to do that, or I guess I'm just doing this because I'm wired to. Because there's a mix of different things, right? There's the desire to discover the unknown or to have adventures. There's also risk aversion, and these are separate traits. And I'm a super cautious person. And so I actually do quite a bit of whitewater canoeing. Every summer I go on a canoe trip with my friends. We'll pick a different river and and several times a day we'll have to navigate some rapids. And of the six friends I currently canoe with, I'm the most experienced canoeist, and I'm the most experienced whitewater canoeist at that, and I'm the least willing to go down rapids when it's on the edge of our capabilities. I'll be like, you guys go ahead. I'm going to portage this one, or because I don't want to die. So I think we can dissociate those two things. There's risk in the sense of like, and one of the comparisons I make in the book is like kayaking off a 200-foot waterfall is not exploring. That's just risk seeking. And it's cool. I'm impressed people can do that, but I don't, that to me, that's not, discovering exciting new things. That's just kind of looking for adrenaline. And so I'm not into that. I'm happy for people who are like, I like watching videos of wingsuit flyers and stuff. I like discovering new things, but I like doing it in a way that, where the worst case scenario is I get wet, not that I drown. I mean, of course, you can never eliminate risk completely, right? But I have a very low threshold for risk. I have no, I have a, I'm willing to suffer. I'm willing, like when I go on backcountry trips, it's like I want them to be hard. I want to have to dig deep to be able to make it to the end of the trail and set up my tent. I don't mind getting wet. I don't mind getting cold, but I don't want to die, and I don't want there to be any like, I'm not willing to, let's say, climb Everest, where there's just like some random chance that could take you out with bad weather or with um, a crevasse or something like that.
And you point out that modern cell phones are a savior. You say sometimes you turn your cell phone off just to give yourself that feel of no navigation and no outreach. But the fact that we have cell phones allows you to communicate with emergency help and have your location exact. So
Yeah,
it
I mean, I have a love-hate relationship with that, right? Like it really, when I started backcountry tripping, when I started backcountry tripping, there were no cell phones. And then for a long time, there were cell phones, but there was no coverage in the places I went. So your cell phone became a brick once you got deep enough into the wilderness. Now there's satellite coverage everywhere you go. And so that definitely increases safety. But, I notice on our trips now, when I'm on trips in the backcountry, my friends will be getting out the inReach and sending some texts back to their, checking their work texts sometimes. And I'm like, man, I'm glad we have this safety thing, but uh, if a work message can reach you deep in the wilderness, that's also something is lost. So yeah, it's a love-hate thing for sure.
I've gone way over. I have one final question, then I'm going to let you go. Um, you point out that running, cardio, very good for the brain. Uh, it also seems to have some connection with writing. I've noticed anecdotally a lot of writers love to run, and there are some writers that are high profile competitive runners. Yourself, Malcolm Gladwell, Murakami. Murakami more an avid runner, less a competitive runner, but I'm wondering if you've noticed any connection over time.
Yeah, I mean, I run in the mornings, which is the opposite of Malcolm actually. Who Malcolm is like, hey, you got to do your hard work in the morning, and then your creative work, and then you can run in the afternoon when you're dead. For me, it's the opposite. I run. I know I'm not going to be able to do good writing if I haven't gotten out into the fresh air, got the brain pumping. And I think there's two ways of looking at it, and I think they're both valid and true. One is there's a physiological effect. Like you're getting oxygen to your brain. You're produ- you gener- you're both in the short term and long term. Aerobic exercise makes your brain function better. So maybe it's just like getting out for the run is getting my brain working. But there's also the sort of mental or experiential or psychological effect of I just find so when I run, I'm a bit of an old school purist. I don't run with headphones. I don't run with podcasts. I don't run with music. Not that I don't love those things, but what I love about running is the way my mind can wander. And often I will, let's say I'm stuck on something that I'm trying to write. I'll head out for a run with the intention of thinking, okay, I'm going to spend the next 45 minutes just sort of thinking through this problem. And I'll be thinking about it for the first, 3 to 5 minutes of the run. And then my mind will just drift away and it just goes where it goes. And it jumps around from topic to topic. It's totally free. It's like one of the few times in life where I can just in the hecticness of modern life where I can just allow it to go where it needs to go. And often when I come back from the run, I'm like, oh, I have a solution to the problem. I haven't thought of it consciously, but just by letting my mind wander, I find that for me is the real magic of running or of going for a walk or whatever the case may be in terms of helping me write better.
Well, Alex, thank you so much. I am deeply appreciative of this time. Sorry we've gone a little over.
Well, thanks, Brandon. It's been a fun talking. We covered a lot of ground. We went all the way back to cardio overweights and deer and explore. And it's fun to sort of trace these connections between all this stuff and fun to hear your perspective. So thanks for having me.
I hope to do it in a few years for the next book.
I'll get to work as soon as I can.
See you.
Okay. Thanks so much, Brandon.